On the next few slides, I will discuss some of the fax workflow scenarios and explain how workflows enhance business processes. Fax is almost always the start or the end of a business workflow. In most cases, a fax arrives and someone is responsible for viewing that fax and deciding what action needs to be done. Actions could include printing the fax, entering data manually from the fax into either a doc management system, maybe an application, or even a database. And in some cases, the fax can be forwarded or needs to be forwarded to another user or group who is responsible for taking action on the fax. When fax workflows are enabled in RightFax, some or all of this process becomes much more streamlined and enhanced. Some of the features of RightFax fax workflows include custom metadata fields, which can be used for entering transactional data. It can also do file locking, which prevents more than one user from editing the fax at the same time. You can define workflow exceptions to accommodate unexpected errors, and faxes are tracked throughout the workflow, and you have the ability to assign workflows to specific users or groups. Fax workflows can benefit almost all verticals, including healthcare, financial institutions, government, and education. Okay, I will now do a brief demo showing you how to create a data Captcha workflow. Before we start the demo, let's go over some details. First, we will define the data Captcha fields. Next, we will assign the workflows to a user or group. We will then define the actions to perform after the data is collected. And finally, we will look at processing time limits and notifications. Okay, let's start the demo. Okay, so I am logged in now to my RightFax 20.2 server. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the Enterprise Fax Manager. And when I do that, you'll notice I highlighted workflows. And the ones that are important to this webinar are these three. So we have our Webinar Pharmacy 1, Webinar Pharmacy 2, and Webinar Exception 1. So Webinar Pharmacy 1 is where the fax is going to be submitted first. That's the first stop. When the fax comes in, it gets submitted to Webinar Pharmacy 1, and anyone that has responsibilities to look at those faxes that is part of that Webinar Pharmacy 1 workflow will have access to the fax. After they complete the required fields and save it, it'll move to Webinar Pharmacy 2. Webinar Pharmacy 2 is more for the approval or maybe a manager to confirm the data was filled out. In this case, we'll probably assign maybe a rubber stamp, say viewed or approved. And then once we complete that, it's going to move to a user called Webinar Route. And Webinar Route is a regular RightFax user, and its job is to deliver that fax with XML data to a network folder, where then it could be used from a third-party application to pull in all the metadata that we completed earlier and pull in the fax, or maybe you would leave it on the folder and you can do searches and find the metadata. It's really pretty open and up to you. So let's take a look at Webinar Pharmacy 1 and let's see how it's set up. So when I click on it, you can see first thing you have is an ID. The ID, pretty straightforward. I would do something descriptive of the workflow. No spaces are allowed in the ID. Description is similar, but now you can add more description to it. You can put spaces. You can go to a little bit more detail about the workflow here. And this is very important. These are the users that are responsible. So anyone in this list, right now I just have one user. You can add more than one. You can even add groups. When that fax enters the workflow, anyone that is in this responsible list here will have access. And last is our metadata fields. So we have our patient name. We're not requiring any of them. We can. We have patient address, date of birth, patient name. If I go into it a little bit, you'll see all you do is the title. You can't have, in this case, you can't have spaces. You define a default if you want, and then you define if it's required. So let's make the patient name at least required. So now I'll say OK. You'll see it's now required. The next tab are the actions. So this is where we define what is the completion action? So in other words, after this workflow is completed, so the fax entered the workflow, someone filled out the name, address, the date of birth, and the patient name. Everything was done as if it was required, it was there, and everything else was put in if needed, and it was saved. What's going to be the next step? So the next step, we're moving it automatically to another workflow, the pharmacy 2. We'll look at that in a second. We can also use another workflow if we wanted, so we can allow responsible users to select another workflow, or so they can select it if they want. So it doesn't have to go. In this case, we're forcing it, but it could automatically have a drop down, and the user can define which next workflow they want to go to. And last is route to a RightFax user. It's just as it says. If and when that workflow is completed, it'll move it just to a regular RightFax user, and it'll be completed. Here's our exceptions. So the exceptions is saying that if I'm looking at that fax and it's missing data or something is wrong, I can check exception, and you'll see that in a second, and it'll submit it to a different workflow where who's ever responsible, who's ever in this workflow could then fix it. Maybe if there's a date missing or date wasn't included, they can call the provider and get the date and by hand type it in. That would be considered an exception. And a removal, I didn't really set up one, but it's pretty simple. It's just saying, let's say instead of a pharmacy or a prescription form, someone sent a menu. It was just it had no reason at all. You can actually create a removal action and then submit to like a removal workflow, which would just basically get rid of that fax and remove it from the workflow. So you can create a workflow called removal, and it would really maybe just store the fax and another user, or just maybe you'd have one field of metadata that you could put NA, not applicable, or something like that. Okay, now you can see I selected the time limit. The time limit is used to set how long until someone is notified about a workflow. So for example, I could set the completion time limit to 4 hours. Now, I could say when there is 3 hours left, so time remaining is 3 hours, send a reminder to Jeff, or I can have more than one user. I can actually have multiple users. In this case, I'm going to get the reminder. And then another one will come in when there's 2 hours left. So the first one's considered a reminder. The second one is considered a warning. So I would get basically 2 messages, one a reminder, and when there's 2 hours left, a warning. So then I would notify the person responsible for that workflow, or the people responsible, that nothing has happened. A fax has been sitting there and no one worked on it. Okay, now that I showed you the workflows, I think it's important I show you how we assign a fax number to a workflow. So I'll go to users and I'll go down to my webinar workflow user, and you will see I have a user called webinar workflow. Pretty straightforward. User ID, just standard RightFax user ID. I can give it a username, password, anything I want, but the key really is routing. So what I did is I assigned the fax number of 5102 to that user, and then the routing type is workflow, and this is how we get it into that first webinar-pharmacy 1 workflow. So someone at let's say a pharmacy is sending in a prescription, and they dialed, let's say they dialed the full 10 digit, let's say 212-710-5102. RightFax answers that call. It then matches that last 4 digits with this user and delivers that fax, in this case that prescription, into webinar-pharmacy 1, and anyone responsible will then be able to work on it. Okay, let's go back to the slide presentation, and I'm going to introduce a second demo in a minute, but I just want to go through the details so everyone can follow. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So our next demo, I'll show you a workflow used for a central pharmacy at a major hospital. So before you saw, I've set up the metadata fields for the patient name, address, date of birth, and the prescribing doctor's name. After the process prescription workflow is complete, the fax will move to an approval workflow, and then we will deliver the final fax and metadata file to a network folder so an external application can import the fax and metadata. Okay, the first workflow is assigned to an administrative assistant who will enter the metadata by viewing the fax. After they complete the workflow, the fax will automatically route to another workflow where the pharmacist will verify the data, add any necessary annotations, and then approve the fax. If the fax is approved, it will leave the workflow and be delivered to the network folder with the metadata so the prescription can be fulfilled. If required information is not available, the fax can be routed to an exception workflow where actions can be taken to acquire the required information. Okay, so we're going to do another demo, and I'm going to show you all the things we discussed in real time. As you can see, I'm back on my RightFax 20.2 server, and I'm going to fire up the fax utility. And I wanted to mention, you can also do everything I'm showing you now can also be done with the web interface, the RightFax Fax Utility Web Edition. I'm going to do it on the thick client just because it's a little quicker, but you can do workflows on the web too. No need to have the thick client installed. So as you can see, I'm already logged in as the webinar assistant. I showed you that user earlier, and the webinar assistant is assigned to that webinar-pharmacy1 workflow. So when that fax came in, or multiple faxes came in, it was put into this workflow, which the webinar assistant has access to. So let's look at the first one that came in at 1:50 p.m. I'm going to double click on it. And you will see it is a prescription form. So it came in from a pharmacy and it has a prescription. My job is to take a look. I'm the assistant and populate the metadata field. So I'm going to populate the name, John Doe, and that is a required field. We made it required earlier. That's why it is bold. The patient address is 1234 Main Street in any town, New York, 10001. Patient date of birth is 6/17/1974. And finally, the provider name is Dr. Jane Smith. Okay, my required and even optional fields are all filled in. So I can now complete the workflow and save it. If I didn't want to, let's say I didn't have all the information, or I wanted to leave something blank, I could save and keep it and then return to it later. So when I hit save now, this will leave mine. It is now not in my fax box anymore. Now, where to go? It went to the next workflow, which is Webinar Pharmacy 2. But before I go into that, I also want to show you another fax that came in, so I'm going to work on that. And this one looks a little different. As you can see, I'm looking at it, it is a prescription, but I see a problem here. The date of birth, there is an A instead of a I don't know what number. So this would be an exception in this case. So maybe what I would do is I'd put in the patient name. I would put in the address. But I can't put in the date of birth. So I'm going to leave that blank, and I'm going to put in the doctor's name again, Dr. Jane Smith. So now what I can do is I can do an exception. So this will hit the exception workflow. I can add a comment. I will save and complete. My job is done. So as the webinar assistant user, my responsibilities are done for now. I filled in all my metadata, and it is out of my workflow. Now that my workflows are complete, let's log in as the webinar pharmacist who is assigned to that second workflow and see what's going on. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to do file open server just so I can connect as another user. Okay, and here's where I'll put in the user ID and the password. Okay, and as you can see, I'm a new user now, webinar pharmacist, and I'm going to look at my workflows. Okay, so let's take a look. So the two I care about are these two. So let's look at the first one. now it looks a little different because now I actually have access to the webinar pharmacy 1 because that was the first workflow, and I can confirm the metadata. So I can say John Doe looks good, the address looks good, date of birth looks good, provider name looks good. So at this point, I can go to my own workflow and I can define it as approved, yes. If I want, I can go to my stamps, maybe add a process, a little big, but let's make that a little smaller. Okay, so I stamped it, it's processed. And now I can add a note if I want, and I can save. Okay, what I would do next is I would say complete workflow because I added my annotation, I approved it, I can add a comment if I want, I can even say approved. And I can save it. Save my annotation, and it is now gone. Let's look at my next one here that came in. Okay, so now as you can see, I still have access to that first one, but now it's in my exception workflow. So I know there was an exception because I could see right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I wonder what this is. So it's my responsibility now to contact this pharmacy, get the right date of birth, and then enter it myself. So I could then put in my 6/17/1974. So now this can be completed. There's really nothing in the exception except to say now it is complete. I could add my fixed DOB and save. Before I save, I wanted to tell you I can also just remove if I called and I just could not get the information I needed, or as I mentioned earlier, it was nothing to do with this workflow, maybe a menu was faxed, I can just remove it right here. But I'm going to complete it because I did get the right DOB now, so you'll see, and I can save. And it is gone. So these are old faxes that came in, but all the work is done there. Last thing I'd like to show you is, if you remember correctly, the final location that these faxes go after workflow 2, after the pharmacy 2 workflow. Let me refresh again. So we'll go to workflow, we'll go to pharmacy 2, and we will see that the final action is to send to webinar-route, this user. So let's take a look at that user and see what happens. So if I go to webinar and I go to webinar route, you will see that its job, really, this user's job, it has one process. Nothing here, but if I go to other, we'll notice that it has XML generate enabled, and what I'm going to do is for any faxes that hit this fax box, sent, received, in this case it would be received, we are going to deliver it to the C drive under an XML folder, XML gen folder, with that metadata. See if I can get to that. So let's go to the Windows File Explorer. We'll go to C, and here's XML generator. Okay, and you can see there are 3 files under C XML gen. So the first file is the fax itself. So we open it up in the Adobe Reader, and looks good with the stamp, the process stamp. So it made it there. The next file is the generic XML metadata. So this is more communication related, date and time the fax came in, was it successful on the inbound, what else do we have, a unique ID. So there's some important metadata here. So here's date and time, the DID number associated with it, and you'll actually also have a failed or successful metadata in here. So this is your generic RightFax XML generator metadata. And now you have another file called the workflow. So if I open this up, you will see just the metadata related to the workflow. So you'll have the patient address, patient date of birth, patient name, provider name. That's for workflow 1. And then workflow 2 was it was approved and there were no notes. So as you can see, this data can be imported into any external application, any kind of database, or even just be used as to look at it and see what was delivered and what happened. Okay, now we'll return to the presentation. So let's look at takeaways from today's presentation. So the first thing we learned is that RightFax workflows provide additional value to internal processes by allowing users with different skill sets, permissions, and costs to manage specific documents and workflows. Next thing we learned is we can leverage inbound routing codes to send certain faxes to specific workflows with view status indicators for each fax as it travels through a workflow. And finally, we know it significantly reduces the number of errors that can occur when metadata is entered, changed, or deleted by more than one user at once with file locking.